All right, folks, we're going to try to get this session underway. It's 40 minutes, and it's a 40-minute discussion on a pretty meaty, broad topic, so we want to try to jump into that right away. So the discussion at hand is read and publish. What changes can libraries expect? The first thing that I want to do is just give a quick introduction to my esteemed colleagues here to my right. We have Catherine Dunn from MIT, who is a scholarly communications librarian. We have Josh Horowitz from the ACM. He is the Digital Library Advertising and Sales Director, and Curtis Brundy from Iowa State, who is the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications. My name is Kevin Steiner. I'm the AIP Publishing Head of Sales and Advertising. And what I want to do first is give a very quick overview in terms of trying to answer the question, how did we get here? Why are we talking about read and publish today? If you start to think back when we started discussing and talking about open access, it's been a good 20 years. But when you look at and think about what has that impact done in terms of the market of journals, the global market for journals is roughly, scientific journals, is roughly $10.5 billion. But only 5% of that revenue actually goes to open access journals. So that means 95% of that revenue is still stuck behind the paywall or going to journals for which the subscription business model is the one that publisher is using for the journal. So within that period of time, we really haven't met or tried to meet the promise of open science, which is open data, so transparency and results from scientific experiments that lends to being able to reproduce those experiments, or open access, where publicly funded research is available publicly. But that world could change. We could see a flip. We could see a flip of that $10.5 billion from being primarily in subscription journals to primarily in open access journals. And there are two significant trends, or I would say catalysts, that are pushing us that way. One is, and both of these are coming from Europe, Open Access 2020. So there's frustration, particularly amongst European libraries and European consortia, with their budgets being dominated primarily by the big deal, by the ever-increasing costs of journal subscriptions, the frustration with double dipping. So not only are they paying for subscriptions, but they're also paying for publication output. Frustration with the paywall itself. It's an obstacle to communications within the scientific community. And that the vision that open access lends is being able to say, look, we have enough money in the system, can we flip it? Are there transitional open access models like read and publish that can get us to a world where we're still spending the $10.5 billion, but it's now in open access journals as opposed to subscription journals? And I think that's an interesting conversation within itself, and perhaps it would work, but it might not happen right away. However, recent announcements, including announcements this week, might actually force the hand and force that conversation and velocity of that conversation to accelerate quite dramatically. And of course, what I'm talking about is Plan S. Again, another European initiative where, starting with 11 funding bodies that said, as of 2020, if you're a researcher that wants to accept our funding, you need to be publishing in an open access journal starting 2020. And of course, that is a tremendous change in terms of what funders have been saying, and funders are really, that's a big change in terms of funder mandates. But of course, that was just Europe. And to be fair, the original 11 funders were perhaps not that significant in terms of output. Significant, but not massive. But then announcements this week, Wellcome Trust has joined and has the same policy. The Gates Foundation has also announced just this week they have the same policy. So I would argue that this particular topic of transitional open access models and read and publish is very relevant today and very timely today. And I would suggest that if you're a publisher not paying attention to this, or if you're a librarian that hasn't dabbled in it yet, I would start doing so, because it's going to be quite significant. So with that brief introduction, I'm now going to give you a quick introduction in terms of what AIP Publishing is doing in this space, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues to do the same. They'll have 3 to 4 minutes to discuss what their institutions are doing. AIP Publishing is an open access publisher. We have 5 gold OA journals. All of our journals are hybrid, and we have very liberal green open access policies. Our publication output by count of articles is actually 18% this year in terms of being open access. So it's a space for which we feel very comfortable. In terms of read and publish models and read and publish approach, we have not yet experimented in this space, but we are aggressively moving into the space and working on solutions now. So don't be surprised to hear that if we'll have solutions available and in time for the 2020 year. So over 2019, this is things that you'll start be hearing from AIP Publishing. So with that, I'll yield the floor to my colleagues and hand it over to Catherine.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. So again, I'm Catherine Dunn. I'm from the MIT Libraries, and I'm going to talk very briefly, about 3 minutes, about the MIT Libraries' foray into OA transitional agreements. So backing up a tiny bit, in 2016, we had a new director of the libraries. We had a new AD of collections, and they decided to form this new department called Scholarly Communications and Collection Strategy. And the idea for that is that we put the collections budget under the Scholarly Communications program. So collections decisions are now guided by values of openness and increased access and diversity and social justice. And in practice, what that means is that we use our budget and licensing as leverage. So licensing, for example, in negotiations with publishers when our contracts are coming up for renewal, we emphasize things like fair use savings, scholarly sharing language, author rights, text and data mining rights, perpetual access, walk-in access, data privacy, stuff like that. In terms of budget, we have asked publishers to engage with us on making our researchers' work more open. And so last year, we, in our conversations with the Royal Society of Chemistry, we brought this up, and they came back to us with a read and publish, what they call a read and publish agreement, or an offsetting agreement. And so offsetting agreements, I'm sure you all know this, but an offsetting agreement is really compensating for the fact that institutions are paying both subscription access fees as well as the individual article processing charges for authors for individual articles within those subscription-based journals. So they're often two income streams for the publisher. So RSC's agreement puts in the same license under the same, in the single cost, the cost for access, the cost of subscribing to the RSC journals, as well as the cost for MIT corresponding authors to make their papers immediately open access. In making this agreement with the RSC, we had several goals. One of them was to experiment with a trusted nonprofit society publisher, and the RSC has been working in the world of OA for a while. So they are someone we've worked with. So we were happy to work with them. We also came up with criteria that our negotiations team came up with criteria that we want to use in other negotiations with publishers, and the most important of which is that RSC agreed, and it's in our contract, that they will transition to full open access. This is a transitional model. We are not going to stay in the hybrid model of paying subscription and OA publishing. We are wanting to help them, and they want to themselves move toward full open access. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hello. Hello. Oh, there we go. So, hi, I'm here with ACM, Association for Computing Machinery. I just want to give you an overview of how we currently view this ever-changing landscape. We're a mid-sized society publisher for those who may not be intimately familiar with us. So I want to just lay out where we see things right now and what our current thinking as far as a read and publish model looks like. And so I don't want to get too much into our current OA policies. I invite you all to go to our website, acm.org, to look at what our current green policies are, but we have a hybrid OA policy in place across all of our publications at the article level, with the exception of the 3 gold OA journals that we have, with more to come. So looking at the landscape from ACM's perspective, you know, as a nonprofit society, our key concern is long-term sustainability. So right now we have, and we have had for several years, what we would call a long tail problem. So we've got about 2,800 institutions subscribing worldwide. And as things are shifting away or starting to shift towards published licensing away from read licensing, the issue for us is that of those 2,800 institutions, there's only about 1,000, the top 1,000 that publish about 90% of the APC eligible articles that we produce each year. I'm curious actually if there's other publishers in the room, if this is a similar sort of a breakdown for you. But another issue that we have with the current distribution of revenue is that those 2,800 universities, again, you'll find there's a top 1,000 or so that are really the core users of our content, and they're by and large overlapping with those, also the ones who are publishing with us, the ARLs, the top research-intensive institutions. So as we move away, again, from a read-based revenue model towards a publishing base, that creates sustainability issues for us, as that revenue based on the read portion is being put in danger, essentially, or potentially jeopardized. Another issue that we have found, that we've identified for several years, is the fact that that top 500, the top 1,000 institutions are using our resources much more than that longer tail. And so this is really illustrated in that almighty cost per article download metric that so many people look at, where the top 500s, the large research institutions are paying pennies per article as opposed to that longer tail of subscribing institutions that aren't going to be publishing with us, that are paying much greater cost per article download. So that's not a real sustainable model for us. So Read and Publish for us presents a great opportunity to better align our revenue stream with our core constituents, for lack of a better term, with that top 1,000 are really the ones using it the most and also publishing with us. It also, of course, creates great risk, for one reason, because of what I mentioned before about that long tail of read-only institutions that would essentially cease to become a revenue stream. So we're looking at a measured, the way I kind of phrased it just in preparing for this was to say measured but purposeful migration to away from read towards publish-based licensing. So what that means basically is over a roughly 10-year period, our ultimate aim is to become 100% open. That's the best for us. I think that's best for science. It's the best for the authors. It's the best for everybody if we can get there in a sustainable way. We've done studies that show OA articles in the same journal as OA articles versus non-OA articles in the same journal will show 1.5 to 3 times as much usage and 1 to 2 times as many citations. So clearly it's the best for everyone. It's a matter of how do we get there and still have a house standing. So, a couple of other risks. On the risk side, I think if we move too fast, we create an issue where we risk author submissions, because if there's not the infrastructure there for authors to pay APCs with us, then clearly the submissions are going to go down. That's bad for science. And this is also perhaps my own editorial comment, but I feel like in the current landscape, you have some huge publishers that I think there's a danger. They may try and force the market towards the APC model if they make the determination that there is the infrastructure there for the funding to support these types of OA, gold, say flipping a huge title to gold. That could really upset the market, create a monopoly in terms of pricing, APC pricing, and also an editorial monopoly. So that's another danger, broader danger that I see. So now briefly just to talk about the R&P model we have in place. Basically, it's a multi-year contract. We view this as a experimental phase for us. So it's at least a 3-year contract where you have, essentially you're taking the current value of the deal and setting aside a portion of that current value towards to a published license, essentially. The remainder goes to the traditional read license. That total value is increasing at an annual rate similar to what the current rate is for us that's negotiated. And then at each subsequent year in the license, that published value increases, which decreases the read value, of course. But then at the same time, the licensing institution will contribute additional publish monies towards the contract, which then is incorporated into the hybrid license in the following year. So essentially, that gives us some financial stability in the long term. It also helps to accelerate the transition away from read towards publish. So we've gotten really good feedback on it. If anyone wants to talk to me about that after the session, I'm really happy to set aside some time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Josh. Curtis?
Well, I'm going to start out talking a little bit why Iowa State is thinking about these read and publish. But before I do that, I just want to say what a difference 1 year being here last year at Charleston has made with these agreements. Last year we were still looking at Europe and talking about these things that are happening over there, and it sounds like, based on the conversations I had and what I'm seeing, we should be ready to have these conversations because read and publish has made it to America. So Iowa State is a land-grant university, and we take that land-grant mission very seriously. It's in our DNA. In our mission statement, it says we should create knowledge, but we should also share that knowledge out with the rest of the world beyond our borders. We are a signatory of OA 2020, so we got the library signed on to OA 2020. We got an endorsement from our Faculty Senate Executive Board. We got an endorsement from our Faculty Advisory Board. So pursuing open publications on our campus is something that we have been kind of charged to do. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through these read and publish agreements. They are not the only way we're going to pursue open, but they're one of the ways that we're going to pursue it. So what are we doing? It's been a very busy 6 months, I will tell you. We're working both through the Greater Western Library Alliance, and we're working individually with conversations that we're having. I'm going to talk first about the Gwella task force that's been working since early summer. We've got about 10 libraries that are on that task force, and the group has started out educating ourselves about what these agreements are. We move next to identifying criteria that the consortia can use as we have conversations with publishers. And toward the end of this month, we're going to have our first preliminary conversation with the publisher about a read and publish agreement. The goal of that task force at Gwella is to get some proposals on the table that we will take back to the full membership in 2019. And this will be like all of Gwella's deals. They're opt-in deals, but we'll be bringing back some read and publish to the Gwella membership to talk about and to participate in next year. Iowa State, as I've mentioned, we have been having some conversations on our own, and I think that Iowa State will probably be signing its first read and publish by the end of the month, and we may have a second one signed by the end of the year. So we're moving fairly aggressively into this space. We want to experiment. We haven't done anything at all like this. It brings up a lot of questions about workflows, about administrative overhead, about all kinds of things. And we want to start soon, and we want to work with folks on the publisher and society side who are trying to figure this out. So I'm going to finish with just some issues and concerns, some things that we're thinking about as we go into this. One, we want to make sure read and publish is a transition to full OA. We don't want this to be a cul-de-sac where commercial publishers lock us in the way that they've locked us in the past. Two, we're very concerned about unintended consequences for making this move. I'm working with the group through OA 2020 that's going to talk about what impact will these agreements have on the low and middle income countries. What do these agreements mean for the global south? I'm sitting in Iowa, I'm concerned about that. I got into librarianship because I care about equitable access to information, and I'll be damned if I'm going to push a direction that's going to, privilege one part of our scholarly community over the other. Three, we need to stay budget neutral. We don't have new money to do this. I see some of these agreements pushing some of our dollars toward publishers where we're doing more publishing and probably less dollars toward publishers where we're not publishing. Four, we're sensitive to author choice. We want to give our authors an opt-out option. Five, there's lessons to learn from Europe. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. When we talk about workflows, we talk about administrative type things. The ESAC group that started out of the Max Planck has done a lot of work with this. So we can lean on what they've already done as we try and get moving on these things. Six, we don't want to confuse our authors, so when we negotiate these, it'd be great to be able to see the submission screens and be able to, so we're in a position to be able to explain it to our authors. Standardization with this would be fantastic. I'm guessing a lot of the publishers in the room that your system doesn't even have a way for authors to identify themselves as the corresponding author and select an institution that might be participating in one of these agreements. I think there's a lot of work to be done on the tech side. And finally, we're not interested in just pursuing read and publish. We want to pursue other open publishing models. I think for smaller societies, I'm not sure that read and publish is the way to go. Maybe a cooperative model is the way to go. Maybe we need to work through a group like Bio One that works with small societies, and we throw our money at them the way that we do under the subscription model, but they distribute it to support open access publishing with those small societies. So we want to experiment in this space. We're committed to it, and I'm just thrilled that there's lots of other folks who are talking about it now.
Great, thanks, Curtis. So for the rest of the session, we're going to have an open discussion. The first bit, we're going to be asking each other several questions, and then we'll open it to the floor. My colleague Adam Chester will be running around with a microphone or waving his hand frantically to try to get our attention. But with that, we'll have Catherine throw out the first question.
Okay, so Josh talked a little bit about how a small percentage of institutions are publishing in the journals, and then there's this much larger group accessing. And I just wondered if the publishers here, Kevin and Josh, could speak a little bit more about how, about approaches that you're using to sort that imbalance out, and also whether you're exploring other models other than read and publish.
Well, thanks, Catherine. So we're really focusing on read and publish right now as what we've identified as the best transitional model, but we are trying to, well, what we've been doing for several years is trying to redistribute the cost burden for the read more equitably so that the large institutions are paying a more commensurate share than the small institutions, and that is something that would have to be done over many years. It's not perfect, but there's no way else to do it without having steep budget increases for some. But there's no doubt about it, as far as we see it, in order for us to make this transition towards OA in a significant manner, we're going to need the buy-in from the large institutions, and their cost is going to have to increase significantly. So.
Yeah, I'll try to take a stab at the same question. I think the rough data that Josh shared during his presentation about the long tail of subscribers versus the kind of the head of the dragon there of the largest institutions publishing the most is exactly the same trend that we're seeing. And this has actually been one of my criticisms of the potential big flip in a very short period of time, is if you're assuming that the institutions that publish the most pay the most, and you shift the burden that is now currently being borne by small four-year colleges that are happy to subscribe but don't publish anything, so they would cancel, to large corporations that subscribe to journals because they use it for their own R&D, but in the future will no longer need to subscribe to it because it's open access. And all of those costs are now borne by the MITs of the world, the Iowa States of the world, the Tsinghua universities of the world, the Cambridge is of the world. If you assume that's going to happen, I just hope that they have a big chunk of money that they're hiding somewhere to pay for all this, because that shift is potentially unsustainable. I just don't see how that works. To answer your other question in terms of what we're looking at in terms of models, I think it's fair to say that we're viewing as kind of a larger community this read and publish model is kind of in one brush, but I really see it as there's many potential models under read and publish or transitionary OA models. We haven't, or AIP Publishing yet hasn't said this is the exact model we're going to use, but we're taking all this into consideration and try to come with a model that we can identify that's going to get us to a point where we can see a way out. We're not only in the shift of revenues, but also in terms of the shift of the obligations of several institutions. So how we bridge that, or whether it's called read and publish or called something else, I can't quite answer, but those are the answers that we're trying to find out right now. So I actually believe it's my turn to ask the question. Yes. Yes, so sorry about that. But Curtis, feel the chime in on this one as well. So my general question has been, and as I mentioned in the open, that so far this has really been a European-dominated thing. OA 2020.org has really been driven by European institutions, particularly Max Planck. There are very few signatories in the Americas, one of them sitting next to me. The others are in California, I believe, belong to one state system. I don't believe there are others unless they're relatively new ones. So, and there's very few, if any, in Asia. I believe there's one in Japan. So my question is, and Plan S, of course, is primarily European until the Bates Foundation had joined in as well. So is there a particular reason why? And perhaps it's answerable, but is there a demand from the community or librarian community or authoring community from the United States that we could potentially see a change in this? Because right now the conversation is being driven by Europe, and do we think that might change?
Well, I'll start with saying there are two other OA 2020 U.S. institutions, Wayne State and the University of North Texas. We've got other folks that are looking at it. I think this is a cultural difference, but I think that the U.S. is catching up. I think this session right here, all the talk that's going on at this conference around, you know, what Plan S means, about how we're going to move forward with Read and Publish, we're seeing it with kind of the structural changes in the library that Catherine talked about. My library as well, scholarly communications and collections, is all under my division. So we've brought all of that together, and we don't talk about the collection the way that we used to. We talk about it in terms of this broader framework of open access and our goals around open access. So I can't really say why they're more interested in openness in Europe than we are. It's been going on a long time. I think that
I have some thoughts on that.
well, go ahead. I'm gonna stop there.
Europe really has some structural reasons for why it works over there. So they have much more centralized funding and centralized university systems, and they have these national level mandates, and they've done a lot of research into the economics of this stuff, and they have national policies. So we also do have some, you know, we have public access policies with our national funders here in the U.S., but the compliance is just getting underway. NIH is the only one really enforcing compliance, and they have a more than 10-year-old OA policy. So that is why I think Europe is just way ahead. They are doing these consortial level negotiations with publishers that we just aren't doing here, and those are powerful things. We need to get, in the U.S., we need to get the funders more involved, and like they're doing obviously with Plan S and lots of other things, OA 20, Horizon 2020, and all kinds of other things in Europe. What else was I going to say? Yeah, one thing that we could do, one thing that we have been doing in the U.S. is focusing a lot on green open access and repositories, and I think that we shouldn't forget the importance of that. And sort of a new exciting trend, I think, is something called, has lots of names, but Academy-owned publishing, where maybe we're linking together massive groups of repositories and then adding layers of editorial journals on top of repositories, and putting publishing back in the hands of the researchers who are creating the articles. Not that we don't need publishers, but there's something to say about giving the publishing back to the people who are creating the works.
My question?
Yeah, your question.
Okay, my question's to Kevin and Josh, and it has to do with back to the Read and Publish. So hybrid journals have provided a secondary revenue stream to publishers. As my library looks to enter Read and Publish agreements, we need to keep our spend at the level of our current subscriptions. Will your Read and Publish model accommodate agreements that are expense neutral for libraries? And if so, what impact will this have on your organization and your revenues? This is getting back at your long tail.
Josh, would you like to handle that?
So I think one of the basic tenets of what we're working with in terms of our model right now is that the place to start from is of the same value, so revenue neutral, as your term would put it. But as I mentioned in my remarks, for us there's another key aspect of this which has additional money coming in sort of a matching sort of a format. ACM kind of putting aside some of the existing contract to go towards publishing, but then the licensed institution also matching a certain amount of money, and that is the best, most sustainable way for us to navigate this transitional period, with the end goal being that, yes, at some point we get to that 100% OA. So for us, this is part of the measured approach for us. We have to choose the right partners where there is a impetus and an infrastructure to support OA, APC licensing, and that kind of goes well hand in hand with the fact that we don't want to open up too much too quickly because of the risks involved. So I think as a general rule, we don't want to go more than 10% of our total annual article output per year. That's kind of a figure we've tossed around as sort of a benchmark, but that's it.
Yeah, I'll try to take a stab at that one as well. I certainly get the criticism of double dipping, right? On one side, the institution's paying for subscription, on the other side, and their authors are paying for the APC. I think at least at a high level, though, I think the statement is APCs or the what we call author choice for the hybrid journals is seen as a secondary revenue source. It is very secondary, at least for AIP Publishing. It's minimal, to be honest with you. Where we've seen growth has been in the gold OA part of our business. That for us, it's much more substantial, and that's where the large portion of our OA output, whether it's revenue or whether it's articles published, is coming from, as opposed to the hybrid. In terms of models, as I mentioned before, we don't necessarily have one to say specifically that this is exactly what it's going to look like. I think that the challenge for us, again, I think goes back to the problem that Josh identified in his opening remarks, which is, how can we do both things, right? Which is, if you have the long tail of institutions that subscribe but don't publish drop off, then in these models, if you have the kind of the head of the dragon there of the large publication output institutions such as land-grant schools, but they're not necessarily going to move up with the transitional models. I'm not sure how that will work. Now, perhaps the transitional models, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is get through this so we still have an organization to speak of, because at some point, if you don't navigate it properly, there's potentially an existential risk to the revenue of your organization. So maybe that's a long way of saying I can't make any promises, but we're certainly going to try to make it as painless as possible.
I just want to add one more point on the revenue neutrality. ACM has a policy, anti-double dipping policy, where we're returning net APC revenues back to academic libraries for the following renewal period. Yeah, I don't know how common that is, but so that's something we're trying to, we're certainly trying to address. So my turn, I guess. Yes. So I'm curious on thoughts about Plan S, and I'm hoping maybe for some feedback from the group here. My initial reading of the mandate was that they're basically, if you're publishing in hybrid OA journals, you're not going to get funded by these bodies. To me, that seems to run a pretty risky line in terms of dictating, publication outputs, for the authors. And there's, I understand that there's a mandate. They want to try and force things in a certain direction, but to me, you run a risk of, censorship for lack of a better term. So I'm curious on the panelists' thoughts on that, or anyone else would like to chime in.
I think we all know there's a lot of uncertainty about Plan S, and I don't think that I think the end of the year, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, end of December or something, is when the detailed recommendations will be more fleshed out. Because you're right, in terms of hybrids, it seems awfully unfair to just say as of X date, January 2020, no more hybrids. And I hope that there will be a transition plan in place, particularly for our nonprofit friends, society publisher friends who are doing their best. And I also hope there will be some support in place for them to help them phase out and to get to fully OA. Some of my other thoughts on Plan S, which you didn't ask for, but here they are. I just, again, I'm going to bring up institutional repositories. I feel like, I don't feel like it is in Plan S. They mention institutional repositories, but they mention them in terms of archiving and their sort of how great they are for archiving stuff, but they don't talk about how great they are for open access, for accessing articles. And And we at MIT and many other institutions have been for nearly a decade focusing on author's final manuscript, getting them into our institutional repository. We have 43% of our faculty research articles in there, and that's not to be overlooked. That's open access. That's, you know, it's a different kind of open access, but it's open access. I'm also interested, it talks about, the preamble to Plan S talks about revising incentives and the reward structure for researchers, which of course is so, so important, but there's nothing about how to go about doing this, and this is a huge issue. So I hope that gets more addressed in the recommendations that come out in December.
I'll just add, I think that Plan S is extremely aggressive. I don't know exactly how the implementation is going to play out. I think that it has been a kick in the pants to, you know, the conversations I'm having around read and publish. I feel like all of a sudden, you know, societies and publishers are, you know, it's not a 4-alarm fire, but there's some concern. And I think that bringing us back to read and publish, the takeaway for me with Plan S is that this is a fantastic time for us to be working on read and publish and getting ahead of whatever is coming down the pike. I know that Robert Jan and David Sweeney were in Washington, D.C. like a month ago, talking with funders, talking with publishers. They talked to Spark. I don't feel like the library community has really had an opportunity to get engaged with, you know, what Plan S means for funders and what they're going to do here in the U.S. I would hope that Spark is kind of a doorway for us to do that. And I'm going to keep my ear to the ground. It's a big deal.
I just want to add about what you said about funders. Funders are so key in the U.S., and we need to hopefully plan, and you know, Gates joining now, hopefully this will be a kick in the pants for U.S. funders, and that they will start to require that the funds that they are giving to researchers be used for, you know, Gold OA publishing.
Great, thanks everyone. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to hand the mic over to Adam. So if anyone has a question, please, we'd love to hear it.
And if you have questions, note your name and your affiliation. So.
Joe Thorne, University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. I had a couple of questions, and just based on, you know, the conversations, and what's been stated so far. Now, it's hard for me to see how it is any different from the current model. And the reason I say that is because, you know, the larger institutions still bear a large part of the cost, you know, with the tiered pricing, okay? There's been a lot of talk about the revenue side, but the question becomes, on the cost side, what are publishers going to do, in my opinion, to drive cost out so that cost can be passed on to libraries, so to speak? You know, because we're trying to, you know, you're trying to use the same cost structure to be able to support OA without fundamentally changing the internal costs. I'm just saying, just from the outside looking in, that's what it looks like. And so you're trying to figure out, how do I maintain the revenue, but I'm not doing anything to the cost side? So that's my question. What are we planning to do to the cost side of things?
Before you answer, I just want to point out that after this session is a break, so we're getting close to the end, but there is some time if you're willing to stick around, and so they don't have to talk to an empty room.
I think that's a really good question. The studies that I've seen that we've done internally suggest that there isn't a huge difference in cost between OA publishing and paywall, you know, for baccalaureate term, paywall publishing of articles for ACM. So much of the cost involved to us in getting the articles out to the public or to paying customers is involved in the organization behind all of the conferences. You know, we do about 200 conferences every year worldwide. We organize those conferences. We have administrative overhead. So we consider that as part of the cost involved. So those are not necessarily OA publication related specific costs, you know, to the actual publication of OA articles, if that makes sense. Those costs are, I think, will not be changed by the fact that we may be publishing more OA articles. But our initial reviews have shown that there isn't a great difference in cost to us if, say, there is a flip towards mostly OA publications.
Thanks, Josh. I guess I would echo the same comment, only to add that, I mean, we really see open access as a business model, right? And what AIP Publishing will be doing is moving to where the business model leads us, or where the market leads us. And right now, that's looking like more OA. But to answer your question about cutting the cost, I think there's an assumption that there's a lot there to cut. We run a relatively thin organization. What monies we do make goes back to our parent, since we are a 501c nonprofit, so it goes back to fund the good works that the American Institute of Physics does. I would only ask at that point, what do we cut? Do we cut out the editorial process? Do we cut out the platform? I'm not sure what is there left to kind of to really cut, again, since we run a relatively thin organization.
Just perhaps another bit of editorializing from my side. It's interesting to me that it seems, and this is totally my viewpoint, that mandates like Plan S are meant to address certain actors on the publishing side, and there's a desire to try and do a one-size-fits-all solution, and that it sort of doesn't address some of the maybe small to mid-sized society publishers, and sort of how they're involved in this whole situation. So to Kevin's point, the publication is really the only revenue, is one of the main revenue generating arms of our organization. We do a lot of other work that does not that's actually revenue negative for us. And so again, we kind of view this as, how are we adapting to what's happening in the market? How are we going to try and work with funders, authors, universities, to try and shift that revenue structure so that we can maintain our sustainability and further our mission to support the community.
Hi, my name is Leslie Eager. I work with Project Euclid. So we have very, very small publishers, university-based for the most part. And it tends to be the case that there's a long list of other folks that library consortia work with before they turn their attention to us. So I'm curious about whether there's a difference in the administrative burden on libraries under this model. Do you think that these agreements will be more difficult, more time-consuming to negotiate going forward?
I don't know. That's a great question. And I am not on the negotiations team in my library, so I don't actually know. I do know that when we, and then this is maybe not answering your question at all, but in making this agreement, which apparently was our MIT's agreement with the Royal Society of Chemistry, which I think was the first one in North America, we're saying that anyway, we had to go through a much longer process than we usually do. We had to create a formal report that worked its way up to our director, which we would never do for just a regular renewal or even a new agreement. And the most important thing that was the most important to our library director as well as our associate director for collections was the criterion I mentioned earlier, which was RSC agreeing that this was a transition to full OA. Our institution would not have agreed to this, to the Read and Publish contract if that was not in the contract itself. So go ahead. Yes. Sure. So this is Sybil from RSC.
Just from a publisher side, it's much more work. Because if you go with a model like this to a customer, and I don't know how many calls we had to really run through the process to explain how it works, what effects it is going to have, to talk about risks on both sides, to get the license done, it's a lot of work. And we have run now through our first renewal negotiations for such deal. That's another step, because what are you going to tell a customer when the publishing output suddenly increases by 15%? You don't talk about a 3% increase anymore. So you have to be prepared in a way on a complete different financial planning. And you asked if you can offer, if we could offer you the same price for a read and publish model. Why? If you publish more than others, then you need to pay more. That's the honest answer to that. And I think that's the honesty which is missing right now in the whole discussion, that there will be a shift of financial streams. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And the long tail who's not publishing, they don't need any funding for acquisition anymore, because in an open access world, they don't need it. Maybe they need to shift that money to other organizations. And that's the big challenge. Who's going to do that? Who's going to shift money from other countries who are not publishing that much, but currently paying a lot, to other countries who underpay in the system? And these are really issues who have not been clarified so far.
And I recognize, the ideal, if we go in with Royal Society, which we are talking with you guys, I anticipate when we talk about a transition, that these are not a cul-de-sac, that we're going to make these agreements, they're going to move toward full OA. What it's moving toward is Iowa State paying for what Iowa State publishes. And I recognize with what we're paying right now for our package deal with Royal Society, depending on where we come in with an APC, I think we will probably be almost awash with Royal Society, but that will not be the case with all publishers. There are going to be some where our publishing output is high enough that we need to pay more. And how we manage that when we have a finite number of dollars each year to try and make this happen, and we need to give this person more, but we don't have the agreement on this side, it's complicated. I'm very concerned about the administrative load that this will introduce to my library, and I think it will, part of me just wants to offload that to the publishers and have them take care of it. When you look at the agreements between Surf Market and Taylor and Francis and their agreement with Springer, it operates like a great big OA fund. And so the published portion of that is just a big chunk of change that goes into a fund, and the library gets a report back on how much funding is happening. We're not touching every single one of those article level transactions, but when I'm talking to a society that has a $10,000 package, they don't have the infrastructure to handle all of this. Now we're going from paying one package price of $10,000 to some number of article charges. That's work. And my staffing is not, that's why we're getting started with this, and we're going to start seeing exactly what our capacity is to do it, but I think that's a huge hurdle. So, great question.
Yeah, great. It's a great question. I'll just add one footnote. I had a conversation with a library consortia from Europe when I was in Frankfurt, and I was asking them that exact question, is how do you actually go about managing and resourcing this? And basically the answer is for every read and publish type or offsetting agreement we put into place, we hire a staff member to do it, right? Because there's no systems there. It's all spreadsheets. And collecting the data and massaging the data is hard when you don't have the infrastructure.
I had a quick question for Catherine in terms of the published, in terms of the time frame, in terms of transitioning to OA. When you enter into the agreements with RSC, is there a stated time frame, or how does that work?
So I think we don't have there is no written time frame in the contract. I think actually we tried to get a time frame, and then and then it just didn't. It wasn't a thing that happened. So they have agreed to the transition. There is no specific time frame for it, but it's going to happen. It better happen, Sybil.
I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I really want to appreciate or thank everyone for attending, and a special thanks for everyone on the panel today. And one more thing, there is a survey for everyone to fill out, so you can go and do that online afterwards. So make sure you get that done as well. But again, we're here for questions if you have any. Thank you so much.
Yeah.